Good writing dictates that I keep this first paragraph short. I don't know why, but there you go. Now, with that bit of writing technique behind us, I suppose I shall proceed on to our tale. I myself don't have the complete story. I'm not really sure why I'm even narrating. Anybody who has had dealings with me is cognizant of the fact that at times I intentionally ramble, and my speech is generally chock full of detours. I suppose I secured this rather ungainful employment due to my deep, illustrious voice. It's a funny thing how a man can say just about anything and sound like an intellectual elite member of society if it's said in a deep voice. Bonus points for a British accent. I could be carrying on about what day I wash my underwear or what day I wash my waistcoats, yet I'd still enthrall the masses. As your narrator, I'm supposed to build a unique and mesmeric setting for you. One that invites you into another world, perhaps another universe, multiverse, what have you. An intro that gives you the sit down and settle in feeling of a once upon a time, or the sit up and clench up grip of it was a dark and stormy night. But really, how do you do that when the tranquil setting you set out to describe is interrupted by our character catapulting onto the scene so suddenly that a poor and unsuspecting creature is sliced in half? A cute bird-like creature, no less. So, please forgive me if I decline to describe the verdant planets, the vivid blue skies, or the Brobdingnagian trees. Simply saying tall trees will not do, as I am attempting to further establish myself as a nimble-witted, perspicacious, know-how-many-beans-make-five narrator. In retrospect, I suppose I shouldn't have mentioned earlier that I don't have the complete story. Kindly erase that view of me from your vacant, desolate, untenanted minds. Very few of you likely even noticed that those three words essentially mean the same things. But I digress. Simply put, your first impression with one of the medieval astronauts will surely be a hairy one, and that really not meant to be a pun. I hate puns. For you see, our little bird-like friend possessed a colorful furry nape that was suddenly split in two when a mysterious portal appeared, and out popped a medieval astronaut. What a sour beginning. The death of the bird-like creature isn't what makes this a sour beginning. No, it's how the medieval astronaut let out a big sigh of annoyance as he stepped from the portal and looked down at the creature that had just been killed. It's how he floundered trying to heave the body through the opening like some buffoon. It's how he pulled something from his belt and closed the portal like the creature didn't mean anything to anyone. I mean, if you're like me, you may have already named, loved, and adored the creature so much that you planned a whole life with it. That's the problem with opening scenes. There's a good chance that early attachments in a story will simply result in sadness and loss. Now, assuming you mistakenly erased the entire opening scene from your Lilliputian minds, let me quickly summarize. The medieval astronaut decapitated the bird, or rather, debodietated. No, that doesn't seem right. Perhaps severed in two is the best fitting description for it, albeit a rather dull one. The severed bird was then bunglingly tossed through a portal by a medieval astronaut on a planet I have failed to describe. There, you're up to speed. After the portal snapped shut, he began to tread deeper into the luscious landscape, encountering more of those dreadfully, detestably pulchritudinous birds, some rummaging for food on the overgrown terrain, others nuzzling their loved ones. The majority seemed to have a clump of marbles in place of a brain, as evidenced by their vacant stare into the distance, completely unaware that someone had entered their world. I'm sure if they had a wall nearby, their body would have been fully planted in the direction of said wall, much like my 25-year-old cat that can't tell the difference between a wall and a display of all his favorite treats, all creatively arranged as if attending a banquet with the finest feast. So our beloved, or hated, I really don't have a clue, medieval astronaut strolled on, quite unaware of the slithering vines stalking him as if he were prey. In a split second, three of the vines pounced on their victim, rendering him powerless, as their tentacles constricted his armored body. If you were to ask one of the natives lurking in the trees, I am positive they would consider the struggle that ensued embarrassing, even if it was an extra formidable vine. The natives on this particular planet grow up wrestling the vines from an early age and can easily escape them by the time they are preteens. But our medieval astronaut didn't grow up on this planet, did he? No, the vine's tightening, strangling hold effectively stripped its opponent of air, much like that of a deflated balloon in the sad aftermath of a children's birthday party. Luckily for our medieval astronaut, he held on to consciousness long enough to slice at the vine with a scythe he had so neatly tucked into his... well, I really don't know where he had it. What possessed him to carry a scythe, of all things, I can't explain, but on this particular occasion, it allowed him to curve the blade under the coiling vine and loosen its grip. I guess it may sound like that was a turning moment in the struggle. My apologies. In reality, the slippery little vines only squeezed harder, almost like it was trying to wring out the last drop of water in a slightly damp rag. Truthfully, if his suit had not contained a built-in safeguard mechanism, I believe our story would have been cut short, but out popped the razor blades. No, that can't be right. Hold on. Well, listeners, I verified that it was indeed razor blades. What possesses someone to install razor blades in an astronaut suit? I guess from madcap, dim-witted times such as these, what they didn't foresee was that while our beloved medieval astronaut was getting pulped to within a breath of death, a gaggle of natives from the trees had encircled him. Ominous though they seemed, their thoughts on the astronaut's predicament proved quite amusing. What a perfectly absurd, fascist manner he is taking. Truly peculiar. Shall we intervene? I can't fathom a more incongruous, uncongenial duo. Surely he is only putting on a performance. This can't be for real. After the vines released their wheezing and spluttering victim, the natives closed in around him in amused wonderment. Never had they seen such a fight, albeit their young often face a similar sitch, but with much more dexterity. Meanwhile, as our medieval astronaut gained his composure, his thoughts shifted away from his poorly executed self-preservation. He became rather alarmed at the large crowd that had congregated. Why had this rabble of inhabitants not come to his aid? He felt a certain acrimonious taste in his mouth, unsure if it was from a sense of dissatisfaction at their lack of action, or blood from an inner cheek injury he sustained in the fight. The natives hadn't seized him, so he supposed that was a good sign that perhaps they didn't have nefarious motives. Snapping him out of his thoughts, a muddled, or perhaps you prefer higgledy-piggledy, series of staticky crackles emitted from a device on the ground. It was at that moment that the medieval astronaut realized what had happened. His mind raced with utter ridiculousness of it all. He needed to be able to communicate with these individuals, and now his blasted communication device could barely muster a beep, let alone translate his verbatim into their dialect. Without the aid of his device, our medieval astronaut was forced to go back to his ancestral primeval roots, motioning here and there, waving his arms to and fro, a whoosh here, a pop there. He honestly would have looked like someone drowning in the abyss, and not for the fact that he was standing on dry land. The natives that had encircled him watched his fanciful motions in the same way that a tired parent watches their kid dance like a princess for the umpteenth time. Finally, one of them stepped forward and put a hand on the medieval astronaut's shoulder, and gently but assertively shoved him forward. Not knowing what else to do, the medieval astronaut obliged and followed the bevy of natives further into the forest. The chirping of the natives' speech began to annoy the medieval astronaut as they walked through the flourishing, animated forest. That annoyance came more from the fact that he had no way to communicate with them rather than the ear-piercing sound their voices made, although that wasn't great either. He instantly regretted noticing their pestilential sounds. After what seemed like hours, the troop came to a clearing, and the medieval astronaut felt a horripilation of amazement tingle down his spine. What stood before him was a stout, healthy-looking village similar to a young lad who, has had his fair share of steaks, burgers, and beef Wellingtons, and now possesses a certain brawniness. Prodigious trees were hollowed out from top to bottom and turned into what looked like apartments. Holes in the ground had smoke rising from them where the natives had fires cooking something on a stick. You guessed it, or some of you may have at least. They were preparing a delicious, I dare not say for us, feast of our bird species from earlier. Perhaps that is why the natives were able to surround our medieval astronaut so quickly when he was attacked by the vine. I can only surmise that they must have been out hunting while they came across our medieval astronaut unceremoniously throwing the oversized bird through a portal. Behind the trees and smoking holes was a cliff that had been carved out to make more dwellings. This is where the natives took our medieval astronaut. Up, up, and up the stone stairs they climbed until they entered a lavishly decorated room, where, sitting on a couch at the far end, was a native that seemed to be as ancient as Death himself. The medieval astronaut must have presumed this to be the elder of the village. The old man or woman began to speak in their native tongue, but the medieval astronaut was stuck on the fact that it would prove impossible to determine the gender of a being that old due to the elder's face containing more similarities with a grotesquely melted candle than with something mortal. Focusing on the elder without any knowledge of the language seemed tedious, so the medieval astronaut let his eyes wander. After admiring the intricately carved statues, beautifully woven tapestries, and other bits and bobs around the room, his eyes settled on a drawing hanging above the couch. There, behind the elder, was a rudimentary depiction of the very thing the medieval astronaut had come in search of. The aboriginal started to get up from the couch in an attempt that looked like a greeting, but the medieval astronaut sauntered past to gaze upon the drawing on the wall. Behind him there was a wail, a gasp, or perhaps it's more aptly described as a caterwaul, that came from the natives gathered in the room. Unbeknownst to the medieval astronaut, he had just greatly insulted the elder by ignoring the greeting. Or he did in fact notice and cared very little, as he appeared relatively poco curante towards their obvious dissatisfaction. Most of you probably glossed right past poco curante, conceivably now hireable as a butcher of words with your pronunciation of it, hopeful that the word was not a key element to this tale I'm telling. I suppose I shall enlighten you to the fact that someone who is poco curante is an apathetic, indifferent, nonchalant person. Unfazed by the disdain, he resumed his dance of the drowning astronaut, once again in a frantic attempt to get them to take him to the object drawn on the wall. Either the natives were incredibly forgiving people, or they were already tired of the medieval astronaut being in their lives and eager to be rid of him. Whichever it was, it happened fast, because they once again started to lead the medieval astronaut, this time over the stone cliffs and into more forest. To the surprise of the medieval astronaut, the elder of the natives joined the party on the march. It was unsettling, to say the least, to witness a skeleton, for lack of a better word, waltz through the forest. After about an hour of silent hiking, the elder suddenly let out a big whoop. The other natives responded with their own gusty whoops. The medieval astronaut pulled out his scythe in anticipation of attack, like he could even wield it against one person, let alone a whole horde of individuals. But the elder just whooped again. In turn, the natives responded. A few of them started beating their chests in rhythm, bodies tightening and relaxing with each slap of their hands, and whooping continued back and forth. This kind of comradeship is often seen in the hearty, bellowing sound of a sailing crew, but this cacophony of loud screeches and whoops was more akin to a band of insects and infants. The medieval astronaut put his scythe away and the march continued. Now, I don't know about you, but after a few minutes of loud, ear-piercing sounds, the world becomes intolerable. Our poor bloke had to listen to that for 4 straight hours, all the while marching through an increasingly thick and humid forest while wearing his suit and armor, musty sweat streaming down his body, forming a kind of glue between his suit and his skin, each step taking more effort and grit than the one prior. With his head surely about to split in two, joining our poor bird from earlier, the medieval astronaut was relieved when the whooping and marching stopped. The party of natives assembled around an unusual-looking tree that had an opening at its base, and the elder stepped forward, gesturing for the medieval astronaut to enter. Hoping what was in the drawing would be inside this seemingly random tree, the medieval astronaut unquestioningly and hastily entered, nearly knocking the moribund elder to the ground. Another caterwaul arose. At the center of the opening was a small stream of light illuminating a knotty pedestal carved from the tree. The medieval astronaut walked over, expecting to find the very thing that brought him to this planet sitting there. To his chagrin, what he found was not what he saw in the drawing. Instead, it was a celestial map printed on a rolled-out piece of animal skin. Although disappointed, curiosity lured the proverbial cat, our medieval astronaut, to take a closer look. The map depicted a circle in the middle surrounded by 9 rings, 8 of which had a single dot placed on them. The dot that was on the 3rd ring from the middle had an X on it. I'm horribly atrocious at ignoring passages such as this when I myself am listening. What I end up imagining is usually quite dissimilar to the actual picture, and more like the drawings from the hands of a 3-year-old that are often displayed on a proud mother's fridge. Therefore, out of the benevolence of my heart, I have provided you with a sketch of what I am describing to give your pocket-sized brains a break. The medieval astronaut must have thought this map would lead to something special because he immediately rolled it up and shoved it into his suit. He turned to leave the tree, but was met by affronted faces blocking his exit. There seemed to be 2 choices at this point that the medieval astronaut could make. One involved pulling out his scythe once again and fighting his way out of the tree where he could open up his portal and leave the Forsaken Forest once and for all. The second option involved him just opening the portal in the tree and leaving the Forsaken Forest once and for all. At the beginning of this tale, I told you that I myself do not have the complete story. That is because I do not know how the medieval astronaut left the planet. All I do know is that he was in a hurry, he did not like chirping voices, he obtained some map, and eventually, most definitely, left the Forsaken Forest once and for all. You may be asking yourself, what of the natives? As far as you and I are concerned, the fate of the natives is much like the fate of Schrodinger's cat. Dare you ask?